This is Jessie, and you're listening to the Curious Cabinet Podcast. In 1888, a string of horrific murders took place in the crime-ridden area of East End, London. The murderer, who became known as Jack the Ripper, took the lives of 5 women. There are many speculations that he had murdered other women, but these were the murders that were definitively known to belong to him. He performed extreme mutilations to each one of the bodies, each one more horrific than the last. These women became known as the Canonical Five. His first murder, Ann Nichols, who was also known as Polly, was murdered on Friday, August 31st, 1888. Ann was born Ann Walker on August 25th, 1845 to Edward Walker, who was a blacksmith, and Caroline Walker in London. She was the second of 3 children. She married William Nichols, who was a printer, on January 16th, 1894. William and Polly had 5 children, and they moved into their own flat in 1875 after living with her father for over 10 years. But over the next 5 years, Polly would begin drinking heavily, and that seemed to cause a lot of issues in Polly's marriage, and her and William had separated in 1881. Polly's father had spread a rumor that she had started drinking because her husband was having an affair, who just happened to be with a woman who's one of the nurses who helped care for her during one of the births of her children. But William said he left because of her inability to control her bad drinking habits. And he also said that Polly had left him multiple times leading up to their final separation. He did have a relationship with the nurse that they were talking about, but he said it didn't start until after the separation. In 1882, William found out that Polly had begun working as a prostitute, and he discontinued child support payments to her. The court ended up siding with him because she'd been living with another man at the time, and she had also deserted the kids and left them with him. So, it's kind of, rightfully so that they sided with him because he has all the kids. She spent the next year at Lambeth Workhouse besides for a brief stay with her father. But for those of you who don't know what a workhouse is, this was a government-run building that would provide food and shelter and work for the poor. The living conditions of these places were extremely uncomfortable. They were overcrowded. And if you were to go there as a family, they would split you up. So the men, women, and children all went to different workhouses. So really, you couldn't even stay with your kids if you went there. The jobs given at the workhouses were extremely long hours of grueling labor, like sometimes breaking stones for gravel and unraveling old rope, which the workhouse sold for money. They would break bones of animals for fertilizer, the animals that they've eaten, or they would do sewing or domestic tasks like cleaning homes, the place and stuff like that. The children were also given these jobs, so I'm guessing that they didn't really go to school at that time so much. Maybe they did, but maybe those kids just didn't. Maybe they had to work because they were in there. It also affected your social status because ending up in a workhouse depicted you as a failure or someone who had moral weakness, even if you ended up there no fault of yourself. You became unemployed or your husband died and you had to go there. So unfortunately, that's just what the stigma was around it. Polly had lived at Lambeth Workhouse until June 2nd, 1883. She was said to be living with a man named Thomas Drew, who was a blacksmith, until October 26, 1887. But after that, she kind of bounced around between different workhouses and infirmaries. At one point, she was caught sleeping rough, which means just sleeping out in the open, in Trafalgar Square, and was sent back to Lambeth Workhouse. It was around this time that she had met Mary Ann Monk, the woman who later identified her body. She stayed at Lambeth until May 12, 1888, when she left to take a domestic position for Samuel and Sarah Cowdery in Wandsworth. I guess that's how you say it, Wandsworth. It was common practice at the time for the workhouses to find domestic employment for the female inmates. So I guess she would clean the clothes, clean the house, all that fun stuff. At this time, she wrote a letter to her father. The letter said, "I just write to say you will be glad to know that I am settled in my new place and going on all right up to now. My people went out yesterday and have not returned, so I am left in charge. It is a grand place inside, with trees and gardens back and front. All has been newly done up. They are teetotalers, which means someone who doesn't drink, and religious, and I ought to get on. They are very nice people, and I have not too much to do. I hope you are all right, and the boy has work. So goodbye for the present. From yours truly, Polly. Answer soon, please, and let me know how you are." He wrote a reply, but had never heard back from Polly, and on July 12, 1888, he had received a letter from Miss Sarah Cowdery informing him that she had stolen £3 10 worth of clothing from her and never came back. Oh, and in that letter, the boy, I believe one of her sons, stayed with the dad and didn't stayed with her dad, the grandfather, and didn't live with his father. In early August 1888, Polly had moved to an all-female lodging called Wilmot's, where she shared a room with 3 women, including Emily Holland, who she became friendly with. Emily described Polly as a very clean woman who kept herself as if she was melancholy and who gave the impression of being weighed down by some trouble. On August 30th, heavy flash floods hit London in the late afternoon. 2 dock fires had broken out as well, and many spectators came to see how badly the fires had burned the docks. Around 12:30 a.m., Polly was seen leaving the Frying Pan public house and heading back to the lodging house. That was like a bar, a pub. Around 1:30 a.m., she was told by the deputy manager to leave the lodging house because she did not have her DOS money. And DOS was another term they used for lodging, like a lodging house. And a lodging house was another place that was just gross, overcrowded conditions that people would just pay for just a simple bed. And it would be bed next to bed next to bed. It was very, very nasty. As Polly left, she had asked him to save her a bed. "Never mind," she said. "I'll soon get my DOS money. See what a jolly bonnet I've got now," as she pointed out to the black bonnet no one had ever seen her with before. At 2:30 a.m., Emily Holland had been in the dock fires and ran into Polly on her way back to the lodging house. Polly was drunk, and Emily had offered to pay for her lodge for the night, but Polly refused. She told her, "I've had my DOS money 3 times today and spent it. It won't be long before I have it again." They spoke for a few more minutes, and Polly left, walking east down Whitechapel Road. At 3:40 a.m., Polly's body was discovered on Buck's Row by Charles Crow and Robert Paul. Crow believes that she is dead, but Paul said he could feel a very, very faint heartbeat. The 2 men agreed that they did not want to be late for work, so they pulled her skirt down and found a police constable to report that they had found a body. One of the things that you should never ever do is touch. I know they were just pulling her skirt down to make her decent, but especially back then because there was so much stigma around anything like that. But they touched the body, which could contaminate a lot of the evidence, which is just that's a big no. You don't do that. In the meantime, another police constable, John Neal, discovered Polly's body. He was joined by other police constables, and they ended up calling a doctor, Dr. Reese Ralph Llewellyn, I believe I got that right, around 3:50 a.m., and pronounces Polly dead at the scene, but only by a few minutes. He noted that there was a large amount of blood in the gutter at her side and claimed that he had no doubt that that's where she had been killed. So this is the details of the murder, so trigger warning because it's pretty gruesome. Polly's throat had been cut, one cut being forceful and jagged, and the other one being a more deliberate cut. The second cut almost severed the head, cutting through the tissue down to the bone. The cuts would have caused an instant death without time for her to scream. Afterwards, the killer had cut open her abdomen, exposing her intestines. There were some other stabbing wounds around the abdomen, not as precise as to the ones made to the throat. There was also some bruising on her face, and Dr. Llewellyn noted that they were very fresh, indicating she was hit in the face right before she was killed. Polly's body was found between a boarding school and cottage houses that belonged to better tradesmen in the area. Her body is found almost under a window of Miss Emma Green, who is a widow with 2 sons and a daughter who live with her. She said she went to sleep around 11 o'clock, and she's a light sleeper but was undisturbed by any unusual sounds until woken by the police. Opposite to Emma lived Walter Purkis, his wife, child, and servant. He and his wife went to bed around 11 p.m. and also said that they didn't hear anything strange. Polly's body was then identified by Marianne Monk, and William Nichols confirms the identity. It had been 3 years since he had seen Polly. The second victim, Annie Chapman, was murdered Saturday, September 8, 1888. Annie Chapman was born Annie Eliza Smith on September of 1841 to George Smith and Ruth Chapman. She was one of 4 children, all girls, and it was said that she didn't really get along with her sisters well. She was married to John Chapman, a coachman, in May of 1869. They had 3 children together, but sadly one had died and one was a cripple. John and Annie separated mutual in 1884 or 1885. The reason, which is unknown, probably stress. You lose one kid, you have another cripple kid. That's tough. But some people believe it was because of her drunkenness, which was also probably contributed to stress. She would try and drink it away. John and Annie paid a weekly allowance of 10 shillings by post office mail until his death on Christmas of 1886. It was believed that John was a heavy alcoholic as well because he died of cirrhosis of the liver and dropsy, which I had to look up what dropsy was, but it's an old-fashioned term for edema. After the death of her husband, Annie became a prostitute because she didn't have any money. It was hard to find a job then, so that was the only thing she could really do. She also had multiple relationships with different men, living in different lodging houses paid by the men, or living with the man she was seeing at the time. In the days prior to her murder, somewhere around September 1st, she had been in a fight with Eliza Cooper over the affections of Edward Stanley, a man they had both been dating. She had gotten a black eye and some other bruises from the fight. Somewhere around September 3rd, she had told her friend Amelia Parker that she was feeling ill and may go to see her sister. She told Amelia again the next day that she was still feeling ill and may just go to the infirmary for a couple days. Somewhere around 5 p.m. on September 7th, Amelia Parker ran into Annie. Annie said she is feeling too ill to do anything, but that she must pull herself together and go out because she doesn't have any money for lodging if she doesn't, which is a shame because she feels awful, but she has to go out and still prostitute herself so she can make some money. On September 8th at 1:35 a.m., she was seen eating at the lodging house where she was approached by John Evans, the night watchman, for the collection of her DOS money. She tells the deputy of the DOS house that she does not have the money, but she will return with it soon, and she asks them to hold a bed for her. Around 5:30 a.m., she is seen with a man who has not been identified. A few moments later, Albert Kadosk, I think I said his name correctly, a young carpenter, walked to his backyard to use his outhouse. He heard voices, followed by a young woman saying no, and then he heard something hitting the fence. Now, I guess, you're just okay, whatever, but wouldn't you, go and check what was going on? Because then Annie's body was discovered a short time later by John Carpenter in the backyard of the house at 29 Hanbury Street. So I'm guessing that's what Albert had heard, was her, getting murdered. Annie's head had been turned towards the house, and her clothes had been hiked up, exposing her red and white stockings. Her hands had been covered in blood and laid in a way that indicated she put up a fight. Around 6:30 a.m., Dr. Bragster Phillips arrived and pronounced her dead at the scene. He concluded that she had been dead for about 2 hours, though the time of the death was kind of debated because of the cold weather. So they're saying that maybe it wasn't 2 hours. She laid on her back with her clothing pulled up, her knees bent up towards her torso, and her legs spread apart. And trigger warning again, this is where we get into the mutilations. Her throat was cut with 2 deep cuts, the second nearly decapitating her. Her stomach cut open, her intestines placed over her shoulder. Her uterus, parts of the vagina, and the bladder were removed and taken by the killer. They never found them. And the precisions of the cuts and removal of the organs suggested that the killer had some sort of anatomical knowledge, so they believed that he knew something about the body somehow. Because how do you just take those parts out with precision like that without knowing what you're doing? The third victim, Elizabeth or Liz Stride, was murdered Sunday, September 30th, 1888. This night was known as the double event. Elizabeth Stride was born Elizabeth Gustafsdottir to Gustav Eriksson and Beata Karlsdottir on November 27th, 1843. She was born in a small town near Gothenburg, Sweden. Between February 1861 and February 1864, she was working as a servant to the Olofsson family. I think I said that right. But by 1865, she was registered in Gothenburg as working as a prostitute by the Swedish police. But in November of the same year, she had registered for working as a servant again. On February 7th, 1866, she had moved to the Swedish parish in London and married John Stride on March 7th, 1869, where they had opened up a little coffee shop. That's cute. It's not really known when or why exactly their marriage fell apart, but she had told stories about the death of her husband and children while they were on the Princess Alice, which was like a pleasure steamer that had sunk. I guess kind of like the cruise ship of their time that people would just take out. It's believed that she was only trying to receive some sort of financial aid from the Swedish church, though, since her husband didn't really die until 1884, and she had been living in the common lodging since 1882. Also, there's no documentation that she has any children, no birth certificates, no death certificates, nothing to support that claim. In 1885, she was seen living with Michael Kidney. Their relationship was described as stormy, and she often left him for long periods of time. They fought often and many times had to appear before the magistrate because of this, which was magistrate like the courts. It's said that for the 2 years prior to her death, she had to appear before the magistrate 8 times for fighting or drunkenness. On September 25th, 1888, Michael Kidney saw Liz for the last time. He had expected to see her at home when he had got done work, but she just wasn't, which was normal for her, and he didn't really think anything of it. He told the investigators that it was the drink that made her go away, and I think she liked me more than any other man. After that, Liz went to go stay in lodging at 32 Flower and Dean Street. According to Elizabeth Tanner, who was the house deputy, also known as the manager, Liz had decided to stay there after another fight with Michael Kidney, but he denied that they had fought at all that night. Liz helped clean up a couple of the rooms for the lodging house, and Tanner paid her for it. On September 30th, 1888, around 11 p.m., Liz had been seen at Bricklayer Arms Public House with a short man who had a dark mustache and sandy eyelashes. It had been raining heavily, so they stood in the doorway, hugging and kissing before leaving shortly after 11. Around 12:30 a.m., Police Constable William Smith saw Liz and a young man around the age of 28 who was dressed in a dark coat and deerstalker hat. Around 2:45 a.m., Israel Schwartz said he had seen a young woman standing in the doorway of Dutfield's yard. He had been walking behind a man who had stopped and begun to talk to her. Schwartz had later identified the woman as Liz. He said that the man was about 5 feet 5 inches tall and around 30 with dark hair, fair skin, and a small brown mustache. He had a full face, broad shoulders, and appeared to be slightly intoxicated. Schwartz watched as the man tried to pull Liz into the street, but then spun her around and threw her into the doorway, causing her to scream 3 times, but not very loudly. He thought he was witnessing some sort of domestic abuse, so he just kind of crossed the road to avoid it, because at that time, I guess people didn't want to get into other people's business like that. But when he did cross the road, he saw a second man standing, lighting a pipe. As Schwartz walked past the second man, the man who was attacking Liz had called out the word Lipsky to him, and he began to walk towards Schwartz. Schwartz panicked because he didn't know what was going on and why this man was coming after him, and he ran and began to lose sight, and he finally lost sight of the second man by the time he reached a nearby railway arch. Schwartz said that the second man was about 35 years old, 5'11", light brown hair, a brown mustache, and wore a dark overcoat with old black hard felt hat. His statement suggested there may have been an accomplice in the murder, but nobody really knows if there was or wasn't. At 1 a.m., Louis Daimschutz, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but the steward of the Men's International Working Educational Club, was on his way home from selling jewelry. He was walking through Dutfield's yard when his pony stopped and refused to walk any further. In the candlelight, he saw a woman lying on the ground. Thinking for some reason that it might be his wife, he went back to the club to get help. He found his wife there, safe, and said, "There's a woman lying in the yard, but I cannot say whether she is drunk or dead." When he returned to the scene with several other club members, they realized that the woman's throat had been slashed. Dr. Frederick Blackwell had arrived around 1:16 and pronounced Liz dead at the scene. The cut of the throat was clean and precise, giving the impression that the wound was inflicted by someone with anatomical experience. It was believed that Daimschutz had interrupted her killer while walking through the yard, since parts of her body were still warm, her clothes had not been disturbed, and there had been no other mutilations. It was, in his opinion, that she had been dead for about 20 to 30 minutes. So this was the same night. That's why they call this the double event, since there was 2 murders in the same night. This was the 4th victim, Catherine Eddowes, also known as Kate Kelly. She was born on April 14, 1842, to George and Catherine Eddowes in Wolverhampton. She was one of 3 with 2 sisters. When Catherine was 21, she became involved with a man named Thomas Conway. She had 3 kids with him, but in 1881 they split up and she took the children with her. She was mostly employed by a fruit salesman and stayed in a lodging house. She was not known to have been a prostitute. On September 29th at around 8 p.m., Kate was arrested for being drunk and passed out on the street. She was placed in a cell until she had recovered. At about 12:15 a.m. on the 30th, she asked Police Constable Hutt that when she would be released. "When are you capable of taking care of yourself?" he replied. She said, "I can do that now." And she was released from the cell at 12:55, which was about the same time that Liz Stride was being murdered. She was seen walking back toward the area where she had been found drunk earlier, which was the opposite way of the lodging house. It would have taken about 10 minutes to reach Mitre Square, which leaves a 30-minute window from when she left the police station to when she was seen outside of Mitre Square. Around 11:35 a.m., Harry Harris, Joseph Levy, and Joseph Lewand, I think I said that right, I don't know, I'm not good at pronunciations of names. They left the Imperial Club and saw Kate talking to a man quietly. She had been facing the man with her hand on his chest. The man was about 30 years old, 5'9", fair complexion, medium build, and a small mustache. He was wearing a salt and pepper colored jacket with a gray cloth cap and a reddish handkerchief. He gave off the appearance of a sailor. Lewend later identified the woman as Kate by the clothes she was wearing. At about 1:45 a.m., Police Constable Edward Watkins discovered Kate's body in a pool of blood and her clothes pulled up over her waist. When Dr. George William Sequeira came to examine the body around 1:55 a.m., he had stated that death would have been instantaneous and that the killer had a knowledge of basic anatomy. When asked by the current coroner if the killer would be spattered in blood, he had said not necessarily. Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown came to examine the body shortly after at about 2 a.m. The body was on its back, arms to its side as if they had fallen there. The abdomen was exposed with the intestines cut out and drawn over the right shoulder. About 2 feet of intestine was detached and placed deliberately between the left arm and the body. The ear had almost been cut through. After the body had been moved into the morgue and had been cleaned to reveal more wounds, it was discovered just how horribly her face had been mutilated. The lower left eyelid had been completely cut off, the upper eyelid had a scratch, and the right eyelid was cut through about an inch. The tip of her nose had been cut through and detached, with another cut separating the nose from the nasal bone. She had a large slash from her eye to her nose that cut into the bone. Her cheeks had been slashed and partially peeled back. Her upper lip was also cut through and slashed in multiple places. These mutilations to the face are far more extreme than the other ones that had been inflicted on the previous victims, and it's just like showing just more aggression with his attacks and everything like that. She had also received extensive mutilation to the abdomen. The left kidney had been cut out and removed, seemingly by someone who understood where the location of it was on the body. I guess because the cuts were clean and precise. So, I mean, if you don't know where a kidney is, you can't really cut it out. The uterus had been cut through and the womb and ligaments were taken, but the vagina and the cervix remained in place. It was believed from this that the killer had a great deal of medical knowledge of the position of the organs and how to remove them. And it's just crazy to me that, like, so he murdered her in Mitre Square. But it's just crazy that when he murdered her, it was in the complete darkness. I mean, there was no electricity then. It was all candlelight. Like, how do you do that in darkness and cut all these things out of the body? That's pretty crazy. Despite policemen and city detectives being around, no one heard anything strange that night. Mary Jane Kelly was murdered on Friday, November 9th, 1888. This was his 5th murder. Mary Jane Kelly was born in Limerick, Ireland in 1863. She was born to John Kelly, who was an iron worker. I didn't find anything about her mother in the information. There's not much known about her life before she moved to London. The only account of her life is the ones she had told her friends, and some kind of speculated that it was very embellished. In 1879, at the age of 16, she was married to a collier by the name of Davies. But he died in an explosion 2 or 3 years later, and she moved in with a cousin in Cardiff, and that's when she began working as a prostitute. She ended up coming to London in 1884 and started working at a high-end brothel. But by 1886, she had moved to East End London, where she met Joseph Barnett. They lived together for the next few years. Friends would say they were a very happy couple until they had started drinking. And then they would start to fight about his lack of earnings since he had been fired from his job. Joseph ended up leaving Mary on October 30th, 1888, after finding out that she had returned to prostitution. Almost every day after their breakup, Joseph would go to visit Mary Jane. On the 9th, he had came to visit her between 7:30 and 7:45 p.m. At that time, her friend Lizzie Albrook had been there with her. Albrook said, "The last thing she told me Whatever you do, don't do wrong and turn out as I did. She often spoke that way to me and warned against me going out to the streets as she had done. She told me that she was heartily sick of the life she was leading and wished she had enough money to go to her people back in Ireland. I don't believe she would have gone out as she did if she had not been obliged to do so to keep herself from starvation, which is like so sad because she didn't want any of that. She just wanted to go home. That's awful. John Barnett is said to have left around 8 p.m. Around 11, she was seen drinking with a well-dressed man who had a dark mustache. People who saw her say she was extremely drunk. At 11:45 p.m., Mary Ann Cox, a 31-year-old widower and prostitute who lived nearby in Mary Jane, saw her returning to her room with a stout man around 35 years old, dressed shabbily and carrying a pail of beer. Mary Jane said goodnight and tells her that she will be singing. She's just standing around in her house singing at midnight. That's so funny. She could still be heard singing around 12:30 a.m. Around 1 a.m., Mary Ann comes home to warm herself up because it began to rain. I guess she was a prostitute too. She was probably out trying to find someone. As she went back out, she could hear Mary Jane still singing, and there was a light coming from her room, so she knows she was awake, and everything was fine at that point. At 2 a.m., George Hutchinson, a resident of Victoria Men's Working House, was returning from the area of Romford. He passed by a man, but he paid no attention to him. Mary Jane asked if he could lend her 6pence, but he didn't have it, and she told him that she would go out and find some money. She walked on to speak to the man that he had just walked by. Hutchinson saw the man put his hand on Mary Ann's shoulder, and they began talking and laughing. She replied to whatever he said with "all right," and the man says, "You'll be all right for what I told you." And they began walking away. Hutchinson notices the man carrying a small parcel, I guess like a bag. He said that this man was of Jewish appearance, a pale complexion with dark eyes and bushy eyebrows, a long dark coat and a white collar, and a black necktie fixed to it with a horseshoe pin. He was around 5'7", around 35 years old. He saw them both walking back towards Miller's Court. Around 5:45 a.m., Mary Ann Cox says she hears someone leave the court but doesn't know whose door was the one that closed, so she doesn't know where they left from. Now, 10:45 a.m., John McCarthy, the owner of Miller's Court, sent Thomas Boyer, also known as Indian Harry, to collect past due rent money from Mary Jane. He knocked and received no answer. So thinking that Mary Jane was just avoiding him, so she didn't have to pay right away, he pushed the window curtain open. There was like a broken part of the window, and he reached in and pushed it open, only to see a gruesome, bloody mess inside. Harry went back to tell McCarthy, and when he went to check on Harry's story, he witnessed a mostly skinned body with a pile of organs laying on the bedside table. Dr. Thomas Bond, a distinguished surgeon who was called to the scene. He reported that her throat was severed down to the spine, nearly decapitating her. Her face was mutilated nearly beyond recognition. Her nose, cheeks, eyebrows, all partially removed. Her chest was cut open, the skin flayed back in large flaps. Her heart had been removed completely and was not found at the scene. Both of her breasts were cut off, one being placed under her head and the other down by her foot. Her stomach was completely emptied, with some of the intestines also being placed under her head and some down by her side. Her uterus and her kidneys were found under her head as well. Her liver was placed between her feet. Her thighs were stripped down to the bone, and there were other cuts and gashes on her arms. The skin from her thighs and her abdomen were placed on the bedside table. Blood was saturated completely through the bed onto the floor. So being indoors really gave Jack the Ripper the opportunity to perform more extensive mutilations without being interrupted, obviously. And Mary Jane was the youngest of the Canonical Five, and she was the last of his known victims. Over the years, there had been over 2,000 different people that they had interviewed, and more than 300 people were really investigated into. There was 80 people that the police had detained, but there was never enough evidence to convict or hold someone, especially because back then, like, trying to obtain evidence, like, the crime scenes weren't clean, and East End of London was just, like, awful. It was horrible. It was dirty. So there was really, like, no way to collect the evidence. A lot of the crime scene had been disrupted by people as well who found the bodies. And, the lack of technology you couldn't use because there was no DNA technology. But recently, in 2007, one of the shawls that was found at the crime scene of Catherine Eddowes had been retained by a historian named Edward Russell. He claims that after sending out the shawl for DNA testing, spots of the semen found on the shawl were a 100% match for a man named Aaron Kamiński. So Aaron Kamiński was a Polish Jew who had moved to London somewhere between around 1881. He was 23 years old at the time of the murder, but was said to have a hatred for women, especially prostitutes, and a lot of homicidal tendencies. There were rumors that he was positively identified by a witness, but that witness was also Jewish, and he didn't want to falsely identify Kamiński. I mean, I guess, in case he wasn't really white, right? But because Kamiński would have been hanged to death, and he didn't want to have that on his conscience. Kamiński was also known to be a schizophrenic. There had been many times he had been seen eating from the trash after refusing food from people. And he also said that he had voices controlling him. He was placed in Middlesex County Lunatic Asylum in 1891 after threatening to murder his sister, and then was transferred to Leavesden Asylum in 1894, where he died on March 24th, 1919. On his medical records, it's listed that his occupation was a hairdresser or barber, but some people believe that he was a barber surgeon. There's no evidence that he ever worked as a surgeon, and his asylum records did indicate that he had not worked for many years. That if he was 23 at the time of the murders, and he didn't work for many years, I don't know. It seems like did he just learn everything when he was young, I guess? Being a barber or a barber surgeon suggests that he had the tools and the blades and the anatomical knowledge of, to perform the mutilations of the victims of Jack the Ripper. So I also had to look up, barber surgeon, what it was, in case you don't know. But there was a period of time that surgeons and barbers were, hand in hand. They would cut hair, but they would also perform little surgeries and did have a vast knowledge of anatomy. They would perform, tooth pulling procedures and amputations. And around 1745, many surgeons were just doing their separate practice. But in some of the more poor areas, maybe like East End London, he was, they were still performing surgery and stuff like that. So it's possible. Some people believe that the DNA evidence isn't enough. Speculators say that there could have been a lot of mishandling of the evidence over the years. But some scientists also say that the way the DNA was tested could match hundreds of people living in London in the late 1800s. But the family of Catherine Eddowes is really fighting to get Jack the Ripper's name replaced with Kamiński's, because they really just want the case closed. They want, closure for all the other living family members of Jack the Ripper. Maybe it was Aaron Kamiński. It's cool that we have the DNA now that we can even try to test it. But if you want to hear a deep dive into this case, leave a comment, let me know. Find me on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and check out next week's episode. There will be new uploads every Tuesday. Thanks, guys.